Hi, I'm Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you for being a part of the course on macroeconomics and sustainable development, and thank you for joining the Google Hangout today. So I'm really delighted. I know that questions are going to be coming in. I encourage you to use the chat box and send me some questions along the way. We've already received in the last couple of days some good questions, very good questions, and I'll start with those, and then I'll turn to messages that are sent this morning. But again, thanks for being with us, and thanks for being students in the macroeconomics class. One question from Osvaldo is very straightforward and brief. Venezuela is officially broke. Bankrupt. Now what? And this is a good lesson of macroeconomics, though a sad one. Venezuela is, or should be by all rights, a highly developed country. It should be a high-income country. Venezuela has vast oil reserves. It's one of the world's largest oil exporters. It has been that way for decades. And if Venezuela had used its foreign exchange reserves well over the years, it would indeed be a very, very high income and successful economy. Yet instead, as Osvaldo says, Venezuela is broke right now. It's defaulting on its international payments. It's in deep crisis. There's violence, repression, hunger. And how can a country like Venezuela, with all of its resources, get into such a position? Well, this is really a quintessential lesson of macroeconomics, of what to do and what not to do. What is the big challenge for an oil economy like Venezuela? It's true that when Venezuela was developing over the last 50 years with its large oil holdings, it earned a lot of dollar foreign exchange by selling the oil abroad in a country with still a considerable amount of poverty. And oil constituted almost all of the export earnings of the country. So if you ask, in what goods is Venezuela internationally competitive? In manufacturers, machinery, technology, you'd come back with the answer, well, it's basically oil. So what is the right job of a government managing large oil holdings? It should be to invest the proceeds of those oil holdings into other kinds of capital. First, human capital, into skills and education of the population, into good health of the population. So human capital. Also to build the infrastructure of the country, the roads, the power system, the telecommunications, the port facilities, so that Venezuela could be efficiently part of international trade. Third, the oil could be the base of an expanding downstream industry, for example, petrochemicals, plastics, and so forth, because oil is directly an input. It could help to be the base for other heavy industries, say aluminum production, which is very energy intensive, or other metallurgy sectors. And by generating a good business environment, strong infrastructure, strong skills, a good physical environment, the oil could have helped to create the base for many other competitive sectors of the economy, where international businesses would say, I want to invest in Venezuela because this is a good place to do business, perhaps a base for operations in the Caribbean region, a base for operations in South America, and so forth. None of it happened. Venezuela did not properly invest the oil and the gas in human capital. The infrastructure remained weak. What did happen? Of course, the money was often very much misused. A lot of it was stolen. A lot of it was paid out as massive salaries to political insiders. A lot of the oil was given away to other countries for geopolitical purposes. But Venezuela did not pay attention to how to invest its oil income to diversify the economy and build a for the economy and for the society. Off and on, I personally would go to Venezuela and emphasize the need for diversification and for investing the oil proceeds and for building a buffer stock of funds so that if oil prices fell sharply, the country would not get into a harsh financial crisis. Well, whatever I said, it certainly didn't have any impact at all. And governments came and went without really bringing about the macroeconomic structural change. Then came a popular, populist leader who first tried to overthrow governments, failed in that, became a strong populist leader, ended up winning elections through the support of the lower classes and working classes and the dispossessed population. I'm speaking, of course, of Hugo Chavez, who became leader of Venezuela. I met with President Chavez early in his administration. I again emphasized to President Chavez the importance of developing industries other than oil, of managing the oil receipts in a responsible manner, in building up a buffer stock of funding like Norway has done, for example, or Chile has done with its earnings from copper, so that if there was a downturn in oil prices, Venezuela would not spin into a financial crisis. I emphasize that the exchange rate, the Venezuelan exchange rate, should not be allowed to become overvalued, meaning that the exchange rate should be managed so that exports by non-oil sectors of the Venezuelan economy could remain competitive. Well, Mr. Chavez followed the traditional populist route. He spent a tremendous amount of resources, often for very short-term purposes. He did not build large financial buffer stocks or reserves to protect Venezuela in the case of an oil price downturn. And he especially let the exchange rate become more and more overvalued, so that if you were any kind of industry other than oil, you didn't stand a chance in Venezuela of building that sector. Well, the result was that Venezuela spent and then overspent its oil reserves. It had no margin of safety. It had no flexibility to move to other sectors or to build other sectors of the economy. And then came, over time, finally, towards the end of Chavez's life, and obviously in a late stage of his political cycle, a world downturn of energy prices. After oil and gas prices went up and up and up and up in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, then they came down sharply. A barrel of oil fell in price from around $100 a barrel in 2011-12 to around $30 a barrel in 2014. The end of the commodity price cycle was called, at the end of the commodity super cycle. Suddenly, Venezuela was spending much more than it was earning in oil receipts. And because of the overvalued exchange rate, there weren't other export sectors that could make up the difference. And because of the overspending, the foreign exchange reserves held by the central bank of Venezuela were going down and down and down and down. Chavez died. He was replaced by an unpopular follower who came into power determined to hold on to power, but also facing this rather bleak macroeconomic situation. And Mr. Maduro, who's the current president of Venezuela, cracked down on protests, because when the economy goes into a downturn, the protests start. People are even going hungry. The income levels are lower. The oil money that then is used for purchases by the government becomes less and less. New sectors of the economy are not developed. So the whole Venezuelan economy experienced a steep downturn. And Venezuela used in this short-sighted way not only all of its oil reserves, but also its creditworthiness as well, because the government started to borrow. And it used various tricks and money lent by hedge funds, who are very short-term, money-greedy companies often, who lent short-term to Venezuela, even though the government had no realistic prospect of paying off a lot of those loans. So people ended up buying Venezuelan bonds that will not pay them now. Well, here's what inevitably comes of these cycles. And this could be called a populist cycle. It's not unusual in Latin America. Maybe the United States will succumb to it as well under Mr. Trump, who's his own kind of populist. But the idea is behave in a very short-term way. Don't look at the intertemporal budget constraint. Don't take into account that borrowing today means crisis in the future. And in the end, the government borrowed and has run out of money, so it cannot repay. In a normal circumstance, a government such as this would resign. Maybe there would be new elections. The Venezuelan people would be able to at least start to choose a different political path. But this regime is quite dug in. It's only for the Venezuelans themselves to solve. I would hate to see any international interference in any of this. But Venezuela is in a very, very deep crisis because the behavior has been very short-term and very short-sighted, and Venezuela cannot repay its bills. What happens in a situation like this? Well, generally, first, there's misery for quite a while, and there's no real way around that, because after so much short-termism, the consequences of going broke are very, very painful. Venezuela's international creditors, in other words, banks and hedge funds and bond holders who have lent Venezuela money, will demand repayment. And some hedge funds will buy Venezuela, and already have bought Venezuela's bonds at a big discount. Say a bond that's supposed to pay $100 next year or in 5 years sells for 10 cents or $1 or $5, I should say right now, very far below its face value, because the buyer understands that the probability of being repaid is also far below certainty. And those hedge funds in particular, they're called vulture funds, that buy the carcass, that buy the bad debt of Venezuela, then turn around and sue the Venezuelan government and say, well, you owe us the whole amount, even though we paid $5 or $10 for this $100 that you owe. We're going to demand the whole $100 repayment. This also makes things very complicated because it's not easy to get a compromise on what to do in these circumstances. So Venezuela is in a very, very bad situation, which is how populist cycles caused by populists such as Hugo Chavez, or in another time, Juan Perón in Venezuela, or maybe in the future of America, Donald Trump, how these cycles end in tears. Someday there will be new government, a new strategy, a big devaluation of the currency, I hope a promotion of non-oil industries. Someday there will probably have to be a compromise on the debt payments. Certainly a restructuring, which means that instead of paying now, the payment is delayed for many, many years. Possibly also some reduction of what's owed through a legal means, a negotiation, a recontracting, some kind of restructuring of the debt, so that the amount of debt becomes within Venezuela's reach. I've not looked at the books. Venezuela still is potentially a wealthy country. It still has a lot of oil. And so how the debt should or should not be restructured is not something that I could comment on now. In other cases, like the one I'm discussing, the debt becomes so large that it simply is not payable in the end, and it has to be restructured downward. A case in point like that is Greece today, because the Greek government, not as bad as the Chavez-Maduro regimes, but in some related way also borrowed too much, built up the debt of Greece. Greece's debt became unpayable. Payments were postponed. But there's pretty good reason to believe that in the end, Greece's debt is going to have to be actually partly canceled, in fact. Greece's creditors, in this case, mainly Germany, don't want the debt to be canceled. They say, well, just work harder, cut your own living standards to leave more money, more euros to repay us. But there's a limit of justice and fairness and sustainability and stamina in order to do that, because if the squeeze is too tough, if the living standards fall too sharply, people really suffer. And there's political revolt as well. So Greece is another case, like Venezuela, where the debt is going to have to be restructured, and I believe it's going to have to be cut sharply. And as the main creditor and politically the most powerful country in Europe, Germany, I think Germany has a responsibility to help find a long-term solution. I personally have been involved in several cases, not recently, but in the past, in several renegotiations of debt, where the amount of debt that was owed was substantially reduced in order to give the government a fresh start, a new chance to move forward. One case was Bolivia in the mid-1980s. Another case was Poland in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in both cases, when the debt was canceled finally, in part, that allowed the government to restart its services and its investments, and it allowed the economy to start its economic growth again. So now what, Osvaldo? Well, a complicated, messy, painful process that is the sad end of a populist phase. Let me turn to another question, this one from Nondas Papa Michael. And I see that there's a similar question from Carlo Pesso about growth. And the question is basically about growth and sustainability. Can there still be growth? After all, the planet is finite. The resources are being overused. Can there still be economic growth? Or should we face up to reality of a zero growth world? And there's a similar question, by Bill Bleich. Could there be zero growth? And Nondas asked the question, can we replenish species? Can we reinvigorate ecosystems? So all of this is about the macroeconomics of sustainable development. And the main point I would make is the following. First, if by economic growth we mean expanding the size of economies using today's technologies, using today's methods, the way we grow food, the way we use energy, the way we drive our cars, then I don't think that growth is actually feasible anymore. Because with our current technologies, for example, depending on coal, oil, and gas, we're putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we are creating massive global warming, which is dangerous and destabilizing. It's causing massive storms, a rising sea level, heat waves, droughts, floods, and all of it's going to get worse if all we do is continue to go in the same direction as we're going now. However, if growth comes not by doing more of what we're doing, but by doing differently from what we're doing, then growth is feasible. For example, if we convert the energy system that we have from coal, oil, and gas, natural gas, to wind, solar, hydroelectric, and nuclear energy, and geothermal energy, all zero carbon energy sources, then we could have more energy, more production, but much less environmental impact. And so the idea of sustainable development is to see if there are ways to enjoy the goods and services that we do now. I like electricity a lot, for example. It enables us to be on this Google Hangout together. It enabled me to have safe food in the morning because of a refrigerator, or to be able to cook the food safely, or to run my computers and do my research. And some parts of the world, at least 1 billion people, don't have any access to electricity effectively, and another 1 billion people don't have reliable access. So I believe in growth, growth of power generation, but not growth of fossil fuel use. So this then becomes not a question of growth or not, but what kind of growth, what kind of technology. And the answer to the question of whether growth is feasible then can't be answered by an economist alone. It has to be answered by economists working together with engineers to look practically at the question of what are the feasible ways to produce more energy. Are they within our budget? Is there a way to finance that transformation? Could it happen fast enough? Or should we instead accept the fact that we're going to not be able to develop, say, as much infrastructure as before? So this is a challenge What kind of transformations are needed? The energy system is a huge transformation that's needed. We have to move from fossil fuel-based energy to renewable and other low-carbon energy, such as nuclear energy in some places. Another transformation is the way we produce the food. If we simply have our current diet, say in Europe and the United States, with a lot of beef, and beef uses a lot of resources because you have to feed the cow 10 or 15 kilograms of feed grain for each kilogram of beef that is in the end produced. If we just do that, and if we use all the heavy fertilizers that we're using right now, and if we continue to use land, clear land by cutting down forests, which not only destroy biodiversity, but also release carbon dioxide into the air, then the answer is no. We're not going to be able to feed the planet, much less an extra billion or 1.5 billion people that are coming in the growth of the world population to the middle of this century. However, if we move to precision agriculture, if we are able to economize on the amount of fertilizer, for example, that we use, or economize on the amount of water that's used by moving to better irrigation systems, if we're able to use higher yield seeds so that in the same hectare of farmland we can get more output without destroying biodiversity. All of these choices would mean, in principle, that one could grow more food, feed the population better, and within the planetary boundaries. Let me give another example. If the diets in the United States and Europe became less beef intensive, so that people shifted their beef eating to more vegetable and fruit diets, or even from beef to chicken, for example, which doesn't have a 10-time multiplier in inputs, but maybe uses 1 or 2 kilograms of feed in order to produce 1 kilogram of meat from chicken, then the environmental impact would be tremendously reduced. I don't think we can go on just with an unending growth of the world population, so that having fertility rates come down voluntarily because girls and boys are better taken family, population voluntarily stabilize through world population from today's 7.5 billion to 8 billion. In the middle of the transformation as absolutely. We have another question from Roy Jansen. I suggest to allocate 1 to 2% of world output to achieve the SDGs. How can we come up with these numbers? Who's responsible? How can we get governments to do it? So this is an excellent question, and let me take this up as a key point. Sustainable development means having economic development that is more fair because the income is distributed more fairly, and also lives within the planetary boundaries of a safe climate, safe land use, the limits of safe water use, and so on, as I've been talking about through a transformation of the energy and agricultural systems and the way we design our cities to be more sustainable. it's possible to do an analysis of how much it would require, mainly of public investments, to have sustainable development. Part of those investments are simply building roads and rail and other infrastructure, power grid, and so on, in places that are so poor right now that they're stuck in poverty and they need more infrastructure. Part of it is changing the kind of infrastructure we have. Instead of having a coal-fired power plant, it would be having a large solar photovoltaic field that would be collecting solar energy and transforming it into electricity. So part of it is transformative. It's not simple to make a world budget to ask how much incremental investment is needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But I've tried, and my colleagues have tried, in the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And we've estimated not 1 to 2% of GDP, as Roy suggests. Maybe I may have said that, but what I think is the right number is more 3 to 4% of world output, redirected maybe from consumption or from unsustainable investment towards sustainable investments in new kind of power systems, more efficient agriculture, better schools, new healthcare systems, and so forth. Now, how much is that? How much is that? The world output, adding the gross domestic product of all countries together, measuring the gross domestic product in dollars in purchasing power parity terms, gives the size of the world economy, sometimes called the gross world product rather than the gross domestic product. The best estimate for the size of the gross world product is about $125 trillion right now. The International Monetary Fund makes that estimate a couple of times each year. So 3% of the world output, according to that measure, would be between $3 and $4 trillion of investment per year. That covers investments in rich countries as well as poor countries, so it's the whole world. It covers investments funded today by government budgets, investments covered by borrowing in bond markets to repay in the future, and it also covers investments in poor countries that are paid for through development assistance from the rich countries. So when you think about how much it would cost to do all of this investment, we have to think about all the different kinds of investments, and we have to think about where the investments are needed and who could help to finance them, and whether the expenditures are coming out of the budgets or are coming out of market borrowing or are coming out of private investments of profit-oriented companies. In other words, none of this is a very simple calculation. But we need to analyze this, and I recommend that every government around the world have an SDG financial plan that says, here are the investments we need, and here is how they can be financed, partly from our budget, partly from the private investment, partly from bond borrowing, in other words, borrowing in the capital markets and aiming to repay that borrowing in the future. And when poor countries come up with their financing framework, one of the problems about being poor is that they'll say, look, Professor Sachs, even if I want to make all those investments you're telling me about, I can't afford it. I can't even afford, maybe I'm speaking of a finance minister telling me this, I can't even afford the kind of universal health system called for in Sustainable Development Goal number 3. I can't even afford the kind of universal access to primary and secondary education called for in SDG 4 because I'd have to hire more teachers, build more classrooms, and where's my budget for that? And so part of the problem for the poor countries is that even if they do all of the analysis, make a proper budget and a proper fiscal plan, they don't have the amount of resources necessary to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's where development assistance is needed. Poor countries should be able to say, we have a plan, it's serious. Here's how many doctors we need to hire, how many nurses we need to hire, how many clinics we need to build, how many schools we need to build. But we can only afford to do half of that. And therefore, rich countries, maybe our former colonizers, maybe countries that have really made life difficult for us by extracting so many natural resources, maybe countries that have made life not so easy for us by all the climate change that is impacting us, should help us, in fact, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's actually the promise in the world community, that if a country can't afford to achieve sustainable development on its own, it can look to the other countries to help give the financing that it needs. Of course, our governments are not very generous right now. Our politicians say, no, no, America first, like President Trump says, which is a bit disgusting, actually, because we've all pledged to be generous and to help the poorest people on the planet. And so we should be taking seriously the kind of analysis that I'm suggesting, and then asking the question of how we make the shift of resources from the rich part to the poor. Let me mention one other way that these goals could be affordable. Some financing of very important purposes comes from philanthropies and donations of very, very rich people. We had a very rich steel industry leader in the 19th century, Andrew Carnegie. You've heard of Carnegie Mellon University or the Carnegie Institute. That was started by Andrew Carnegie. He was one of the richest people in American history. And he said, it's a shame for a rich person to die with their wealth. It's their responsibility, their moral responsibility, to use that wealth for the benefit of the community, of the society where they live. He called it the gospel of wealth. And he said that I don't really own this wealth. I am the steward. I'm the responsible individual for the effective use of this wealth on behalf of the world community. Well, there have been many important large philanthropists in history. Andrew Carnegie, one of the most famous. John D. Rockefeller from the Standard Oil Company and oil wealth created one of the most important foundations in history. And in our time, the biggest philanthropist in the world is Bill Gates, the founder and former CEO of Microsoft. And he's traditionally been counted as the world's richest person, or maybe number 2 some years, but very wealthy. And he created with his wife the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they are spending several $billion a year, especially around public health. Now, I mention this because in addition to governments, if you look at the amount of wealth of the richest people in the world, it's a lot of resources. If you look at the people whose net worth is estimated to be at least $1 billion, that list is about 2,000 individuals. And they're combined net worth, if you add up their wealth across all of those 2,000 individuals, is estimated to be about $8 trillion a year. So if the richest people in the world gave even just 1% of their wealth every year, and that would only be a fraction of what they're earning on that wealth, that would be about $80 billion, because 1% of $8 trillion is $80 billion. Well, an incremental $80 billion would be enough to help the poorest countries to build hospitals and clinics and schools and to achieve SDG 3 and SDG 4. And so this is another way that we could mobilize the resources, partly through development aid, partly through the national budgets of the poor countries, because they have to pay a lot of what they need, even if it's not the full amount, and partly through the development cooperation that could come through philanthropists. And so this is a call that I often make on the world's philanthropists. Please step up. You have a big responsibility. You have a lot of wealth, and you have a big opportunity to play a huge role in sustainable development. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. And so let me use the remaining moments that we have together to thank you for being students in the course on macroeconomics and sustainable development. It's a privilege to have you as students, and I believe that all of us should be in a common effort to achieve sustainable development in a context of good macroeconomic policy, which you've now learned a lot about. We have to avoid the terrible populism that bankrupted Venezuela and that could bankrupt the United States because Trump is also a populist in that irresponsible way. We have to look to sustainable development, meaning that we have to shift investments so that the economy is more fair and more environmentally sustainable, so that every person can get access to their basic needs, whether it's health, SDG 3, education, SDG 4, safe water and sanitation, SDG 6, electrification from renewable energy, SDG 7. All those are basic needs. So now you are going to be leaders of sustainable development. I hope you will be good stewards of the macroeconomy. And thank you for being on today's Google Hangout. Thank you for being students in the class on macroeconomics and sustainable development. And I look forward to meeting you in person sometime in the future. Thanks again, and look forward to meeting you. Bye-bye.